future as regard to its pension obligations, but also the costs that cities and towns are accruing into the future for their medical and other benefits as well. So originally actually still the plans were due to the state of Rhode Island this past November. And the town had gone through a series of studies with its actuaries that were not completed at that time. So we've just recently, along with some other cities and towns, submitted our plan to the state of Rhode Island. The information that you have in front of you is an explanation of the exercise and analysis that the town went through and undertook in order to address both that OPEB issue and the funding of the pension as well. Now, by way of background, the town of Johnston was a little bit ahead of the curve of the legislation because, as many of you know, the town enacted a series of comprehensive pension reform ordinances and established for the first time in the history of the town of Johnston a retirement board to act essentially as the trustees for the local pension trust fund. And as many of you know, certain aspects of that pension reform are essentially right now being litigated in Superior Court. And the town continues essentially to defend its legal rights, in fact, what it believes what it was required to do in regard to the enactment of those pension reforms. And so you should understand that the information I'm about to share with you at this time assumes the validity of those pension ordinances. In addition to that, all of you know that the town enacted a series of ordinances which we called our Municare ordinances, pursuant to a state law, which essentially what the town did, and you've all been through the exercise, essentially transferred the retirees over to Plan 65. And that was part of the OPEB issues that the town was trying to address. In a minute, I'll highlight for you what the town accomplished by doing that. And also, thank you ahead of time for your cooperation in making that happen. Now, the other post-employment benefits component of this, which appears on the first page, just illustrates for you the significance of what the town was able to accomplish with your assistance. And I'm not going to go through the document verbatim, but I'm going to call your attention to what I think is some important information. If you look about halfway down the page, you'll see a paragraph entitled Plan Before Medicare Changes. And that shows the unfunded actual accrued liability of $229 million, a little over $229 million. And based upon the analysis that the actuaries had completed for the town, that number was going to rise to over $258 million in the year 2012 without any changes. And essentially what that meant is that the annual required contribution in order to address that unfunded liability at that time was over $17 million. You'll see that number right there as the third bullet point. Now, after the Medicare changes, after the enactment of the ordinance, and after, with your assistance and with your help, with those changes going on to Plan 65, you'll see the very significant impact it had on those numbers. the unfunded actuarial accrued liability went down to essentially $187 million. Essentially over $71 million less than the 2012 valuation indicated by the actuary if there had been no changes. It reduced the annual required contribution from over $17 million to $14.7 million, just with that change. Now, in terms of addressing that OPEB obligation that is required under the statute, as well as the pension changes, the actuarial gain was over $42 million, and the savings on the ARC, the annual required contribution, was about $2.5 million. Now, we're not done yet, because we still have to address that. And so what you're going to see happen, this is the 28th or the 1st? This is the 28th. What you're going to see happen next month, you'll see some very important ordinances being brought to the town council in regard to the OPEB obligation. We are going to present the town council with an ordinance that will allow it to set up an OPEB trust, similar to the pension trust that we did just a couple of years ago. And with that, we're going to be suggesting a funding recommendation to the town, a mechanism, in order to fund that OPEB trust. We anticipate that at the conclusion of that process, and it will be a process, it's not a matter of just enacting the ordinance and then watching the OPEB liability diminish, but after the process of enacting the ordinance, doing the right analysis on the funding, and going through that funding, we expect to see even more dramatic changes in the town's unfunded OPEB liability. Now, turning our attention to the state statute and what the town has been required to do with the pension. Said a moment ago, the town had enacted the ordinances providing for the establishment of the pension trust fund, so that when the statute was passed and certain obligations were imposed on the town, we were ready to meet the town's obligations under those statutes. As a consequence, the pension board that was created by that ordinance undertook the tasks of choosing an actuary and then essentially having that actuary prepare certain studies known as experience studies to give us very current, up-to-date information. One of the reasons, in fact, that we chose not to meet the initial November deadline in filing our plan with the state is because we wanted current and fresh information. We wanted that information to be as current as possible. And ultimately, the plan that we submitted is based upon information provided to us through January 31 of this year, going back to July 1. But in order to get that study done for those July 1 numbers, which we wanted to have, it took our actuaries through that time period to get it done. Now, once that information was done, in other words, the pension board essentially went through the diligence of having those studies done, adopting recommended assumptions for purposes of completing the experience study and presenting that to the state. What it showed, and it doesn't surprise anybody in this room, I'm sure, is that the town's pension fund is in critical status. To put it in very practical terms, the town's pension fund probably has about 5 or 6 years of life left in it without any changes being made. From the mayor's point of view, even though the state characterize this as a funding improvement plan. From the mayor's point of view, it is his plan to save your pensions. It is his plan to protect your pension benefits and to prevent the trust fund from going into insolvency. Now, look at the numbers. I'll just call your attention to about 1/4 of the way down the second page. The updated pension plan valuation provided us with the following information. The actuarial accrued liability was essentially $148 million. Unfunded, $110 million. The funded percentage, 25.7%. And the ARC for the pension plan, meaning both police and fire, is $12.8 million. Essentially what that means is that to meet those funding numbers, the town would need about $12.8 million of tax-funded contributions to the plan in order to meet that annual required contribution. And then a number that I think is very telling, sort of a very practical way of looking at things. If you look at that contribution as a percentage of our current public safety payroll, that would be 137.8% of public safety payroll in the town of Johnston. Now, when the town began the study, it used sort of standard starting points, standard reference points, if you will, both throughout the state of Rhode Island and throughout the nation, because this is not just a Johnston problem, it's not just a Rhode Island problem, it's a problem across the Republic. And so we looked at things as a starting point to see what our options could be. We looked at the same things that people looked at all over the country. So one of the first things we looked at is what's the definition for the pension? Translation is, what are the components that go into calculating the pension benefit? And so we looked at changing that pension benefit definition for active employees and essentially modeling it on what is a very common model throughout the country and here in the state of Rhode Island, of basing that on base pay, holiday pay, and longevity. Now, if you see that, the parenthesis number at the end of each one of these bullet points, what that means is the savings on that arc. So you'll see that if we did that, that only gave us a little over $11 million in savings. Changing the salary averaging from 3 to 5 years, 12.4, and so on. And you can look at each one of the items that we asked the actuaries to do a run on. Changing the salary averaging from 3 to 7, from 3 to 10, cap the COLA increase at 2.5 under any circumstance, and cap COLA increases for all retirees receiving a higher than $40,000 annual benefit. And then you'll see we looked at a run to what happens if we eliminated future COLA increases for actives and retirees. So you see the numbers there. Now, what happened, and I'm not going to bore you by walking you point by point through each one of the studies, but what happened is, obviously, that for a study, we saw that we had significant work to do. I'd say that it was probably a breathtaking awakening when we saw that. No, that becomes the ARC. Did I say that? Oh, I'm sorry. There's a savings to the ARC, but that number of parentheses is what the ARC becomes. So I apologize if I said that correctly. So for instance, so let me clarify it. So for instance, it would go from 12.8 to 11.1. Okay? It represents there is a savings, but that's the new ARC. So you can see the savings is the difference between the 12.8 and the 11.1. Now, when we saw that, we understood that we had a lot of work to do. And following the recommendations of the actuaries, we began to run different models. Our hope was, for lack of a better explanation, was to try to create a menu of options for the town. And to say, well, okay, if we do this option, that's going to work. Let's choose this option, that might work. But as you can see, even looking at the items collectively, we weren't getting very close to what the state mandated. And in broad terms, there are some other specifics to it, but in broad terms, what the state has required us to do is to submit a plan that gets us out of critical status, and they define that as being 60% funded within 20 years. So that's what we had to get to in order to satisfy the statutory, regulatory, and guideline requirements of the state. Now, I'm not going to walk you through each phase, but I think it's important that you have a chance to look at this information, because you will see the depth of the analysis and the various alternatives that the town looked at before it submitted its plan to the state. So what I'm going to do is ask you to just kind of go to page 4, because that's when we get to the conclusions. Now, after running all of those various scenarios that we characterize as phases, with all those different options in them, no matter how we sliced and diced it, based on the information and the recommendations that we're getting from our actuaries, we were still coming up about 1.7 million short. And that's that paragraph at the top of the page there, phase 6. And it was suggested at that point that perhaps the only alternative the town could look to would be to do layoffs within the public safety portion of the budget, which is police and fire. And I can tell you, the mayor's authorized me to tell you, that the mayor rejected that out of hand.
Wow.
The mayor's position is that the staffing within our police and fire departments need to be what they are in order to protect the safety, the welfare of the citizens of the town of Johnston, and in order to protect the safety and welfare of our police officers and firefighters. So that still has, what that means is that we still have a $1.7 million set or amount of money that we have to find within our public safety budget somehow or other. Now, with that, we submitted a plan to the state. They're going to take you down to the bottom where it says conclusion. You can go right down to the bullet points. The plan we submitted to the state suggests the following, or tells the state this is our plan. Number 1, implement a minimum retirement age of 55. Second bullet point, change the pensionable earnings calculation to include only base pay, holiday pay, and longevity. Change the salary averaging to 10 years. Freeze COLA increases for 20 years. When the COLA returns after the 20 years, it will be an indexed COLA. It will be indexed based on the Northeastern Urban CPI, Consumer Price Index, and only applies to those receiving a benefit less than 150% of the Rhode Island mean income. Now let me explain to you a little bit what that means. Because 150% of the Rhode Island mean income is, in our view, a substantial amount of money. The most recent study done in this past year, it's about $78,000. Based upon the information that we're seeing, although not formally published yet, we expect that number for this year to be in the low 80s, about 82,000. We're going to reset the amortization period to 24 years. Think about that as kind of when you refinance your house, if anybody's ever had to do that. You have a 30-year mortgage, and after 15 years you decide you want to refinance your house, so you go from 15 to 20 years when you refi. So we're resetting it from 18 to 24. The last one, we admit, is the biggest challenge. And that's that $1.7 million that we still need to identify to the state. And that's to reallocate public safety resources in a way that does not jeopardize the health and safety of its residents, but allows for greater funding of retirement benefits, to translate $1.7 million. Now, as you can see, there's a combination of changes here that affect both active and retired. You can see that there's a mix of changes that we are recommending as part of the plan that we have submitted to the state. Now, you'll note at the bottom in the closing that the town will seek first and foremost, it's our goal, to negotiate with the town's active employees and retirees. We have advised the state of that. When we submitted it to the state, we have told them that this is our plan, but it is our intent to have a discussion with our active employees and to negotiate these changes in good faith with them and to have that discussion with you. Now, obviously, in the event that those discussions and negotiations fail to result in a plan that gets us to that 60% funding in 20 years, at that time, sometime in the future, the town will be forced to see what other legal options may be available to it. But the town's preference, strong preference, is to attempt to come to a plan through negotiations and discussions with you. Now, we have talked to the actives, and we understand that because there are suggestions that affect actives in one way and retired employees in another way, completely understand that the interests of the actives and retirees are not necessarily coextensive here, and may, at occasion, even be in conflict. But we are nevertheless prepared, even with those circumstances, to sit down with both groups separately and try to get to that 60% in 20 years. Now, I'll tell you that, as I said, we only submitted the plan to the state a little while ago. And if you've been following this, which I'm sure you have, which is of great interest to you, if you've been following this in the media, you saw an article in the paper just a couple of days ago, and that article said that the cities and towns that submitted plans that didn't meet all of the guidelines that the state is attempting to impose on the cities and towns, that we would be called in, those cities and towns would be called in to make a presentation. I want to tell you now, because I don't want it to cause anxiety when it becomes a topic of discussion. We've already received some initial communication from the state that the state does not believe that we drilled down hard enough. That the state, in getting to that 60% funding in 20 years, would probably prefer some other approaches than the ones we have chosen here, and have signaled to us that they expect us to drill down a little harder. It is the administration's position at this time that it is going to stand by the plan it submitted and stand by any other plan if, in fact, as a result of our negotiations and our discussions, we come to any modifications that you point out to us that still meet that standard of 60% in 20 years and that we amend and submit, we are prepared to stand by it. Now, talk a little bit about process, if I may. We have begun our discussions with our active employees, our police and fire unions. And essentially what we did, and we'll do for your groups as well, is we provided them with the nuts and bolts, the details, every piece of analysis and information that the town's actuaries relied upon to construct this plan. We provided that to both the police and fire unions. And it's a book about, here it is. This is it. So when you see this executive summary that you have in front of you that talks about phase 1, phase 2, here's the book that contains all the information that the actuaries relied upon and all the analysis that they did. Now, what we told our active employees, and we're telling you the same thing, that we are absolutely prepared to make that available to you so that you can take it to whatever actuary you want to review it, comment on it, and you should also know that we've instructed our actuaries that they will be accessible and available to whatever actuary experts you choose to have review this. It will be as open and transparent as anything can be with actuaries. So tonight, we wanted to tell you firsthand what's going on, so you're not reading about it in the papers. We wanted to talk to you about process. Now, as you may know, this process is not unique to the town of Johnston. It's going on all over the state of Rhode Island. It's happened in some other cities and towns a little bit ahead of us, most notably the city of Providence. and it's going to be happening in other cities and towns that are probably a little bit behind us in this work. But a methodology has been evolving that we think the courts have acted upon favorably. Joe's been involved in it already, representing parties in some of these other actions. And so what we're asking you to do is essentially to follow that model. And what that model is to essentially form your associations, whether it be, you know, the police retirees, the fire retirees, to form your associations, identify for us who the spokespeople are for those associations, so that we can begin in an orderly way, in an informative way, in an open and transparent way, the discussion that I just talked to you about. Now, as we go through that process, and we work our way through it, nothing's perfect. For instance, in the Providence model, and you know it personally, Joseph, you correct me if I'm wrong, because I'm just going based on what you've explained to me and what I've read in the court papers. There was an opt-out clause from the association. So that a retiree, for instance, who chose not to become a part of the group could opt out, and that retiree is essentially free to do whatever they think they need to do in regard to their pension. But we think the best way to proceed is essentially based on that model, a model that's worked in Providence, a model that's already being followed in other cities and towns. And so what we're asking you to do is to form those associations and then contact us so we can set up those discussions, provide that information to you, do whatever we can do in order to make you a part of the process, and essentially when you go through the information, answer whatever questions we can about it. Now, I don't know if you want to add to that part of it, guys.
Well, if they opt out, they have to individually represent themselves. Right?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, that's right. Anybody, again, so that some of you are sitting there looking at your neighbor and saying, you know, I don't want to be in the same club as that guy. You do have the ability to opt out, but you represent yourself when you do that, since you represent yourself individually. But you know, that's a model that obviously got to a conclusion in Providence. It seems to be working well in some other communities that have begun to do it. That's the model we would like to try to follow here as well. Yes, sir.
I just got one question on this whole matter. I know it's a 20-year proposal for after no COLA for 20 years.
Yes, sir.
I got the Providence pension ordinance right here, as we speak. He's part of that, I guess. It says here, for 10 years their COLAs are suspended. 10 years. After the 5th year, I don't know before, January 31st, 2018, a $1,500 stipend will be paid to each retired guy that's making under $100,000. Now, if you're trying to follow, you're saying you're trying to follow other cities, towns throughout the country, and Providence was probably one of the first ones in the state to go through this here. They're giving their retired guys a $1,500 payment after 5 years. 8 years, another $1,500, and then after 10 years, they're going back to their 3% compounder rates. Their raises. Most of us in this room here, I'm 60, I'll be 67, I'll be 87 before we see a penny. I'll be in St. Anne's. A lot of us will be in St. Anne's, but in 10 years, it's right here. You want to read what I got here?
No, we're well aware of it. I'll answer your question. I'll answer your question.
Yeah.
I'll answer your question.
You said you're trying to follow the model like of the other cities and towns.
Actually,
we'll take Providence right now.
You let me know when you're done and I'll answer your
Okay,
question.
I'm done. I'm done.
Okay, thank you. Okay. What I said was, we looked at the reference points and benchmarks to begin the study. And what you will see as you go through this is that every city and town in the state of Rhode Island and every city and town throughout the country is unique in how their pension is structured, what is causing the deficit accrual, and that each plan needs to be specific to the structure of that pension and to address the specific causes of the accrual deficit. So no two plans are going to look alike. There is no one-size-fits-all remedy for this problem. If there was, you wouldn't be seeing the state of Rhode Island requiring every single city and town to submit its plan, every city in critical status, to submit its plan, and then scrutinizing it. So one size won't fit all. So no matter where you look, you're going to see a different solution in each city and town. Joe, do you want to address that one?
Yes.
So let me just answer your question, why I was done in Providence that way. First of all, Providence was over 40% funded. Second of all, the driver in Providence, as Billy referenced, there are drivers. The driver is many people getting 5 and 6% COLAs. So by freezing that for 10 years, bringing the COLA from 5 and 6% down to 3% in the 11th year, that's how they got to 80% funded. So that's why the time frame is different, and that's why there's 2 bump ups in stipends. It's not additive. So the $1,500 each year doesn't get added to your base pension. It's just an extra check.
No, I understand.
I'm just explaining to you why the difference is there.
No, it's not added to your pension,
Right.
but at least they offered them something.
They did, because they could still, I represented active police in that case. Joe Penza represented police and fire retirees, and Ed Roy represented fire active. The reason that was structured that way is because we could fit that in without by hitting the threshold at the 20 years we had to hit, and we could still achieve it. But A, Providence started out 15 points higher, I think maybe 18 points higher in terms of funding, and B, the component that was driving that bus was 6%, 5% compounded COLA. Big difference.
Mr. Royal, isn't it true to say that Providence deal is not done yet? There's a hearing next Wednesday?
The Providence deal, the retiree piece is not done.
That's correct.
And the retiree piece has got an opt-out clause, I believe, the 1st of April.
And there's a fairness hearing being held next week before Judge Steph Carter, March 3rd.
That's the retiree piece, not the active
Well,
piece.
that's
I'm
right.
not part of the
Well, we're retirees.
I understand.
Bill, I have a question. As you know, I'm going to be representing a group of retired police officers. Some of those individuals are retired under different contracts. What I'm trying to wrap my mind around is, what's the town's definition of a COLA? In other words, I don't believe before 2005 that term was used in the contract. So does a COLA mean pension escalation clauses?
Yeah.
What does it mean? I need to understand that so I can advise these folks.
Yeah, pension escalation.
So is it,
I'm sorry, if you want to use the term pension escalation.
so it's anything that an individual may receive above their base pension?
Yes.
So,
Not the longevity, but.
No. I didn't get the 5% on his longevity after retirement.
10%.
10%. Oh, thank you. 10%.
so the town's position is that it doesn't, the term COLA does not include longevity on top of your base pension.
Right.
And what's the logic behind that, just so I can explain it to these folks?
It was the components we were working with. I mean, when we did the analysis, we tried to look at as much as we could. We didn't attack and try to roll back anybody's existing pension. So we looked at the base pension and the longevity as part of the pension. So that was the total package we looked at. The COLA or the cost of the increase, the adjustment, that was the annual increase that drives the actuarial number.
So you're not looking, your logic is that you're not looking as the COLA as part of the pension when you made your analysis.
Right.
But your logic is that the longevity is part of the pension.
Right, and the reason for that, so you understand, is from the actuary, because we were dealing with actuaries. If we leveled off, then the pension doesn't change, even if you add the longevity, it doesn't change with those two components year over year. So the number is level. But as soon as you start compounding the COLA, as soon as you add that number, whether it's 1.5% or 3% a year, then that becomes a cumulative number and you get a multiplier effect. That was the reasoning behind it.
Mr. Conley, I understand, and I think a lot of people here do understand that the severity of the situation we're in. We didn't get here as the police and fire, retired, active, whatever. I haven't heard anything in this plan where the administration, this administration, previous administrations, accepts any responsibility whatsoever for where we are right now. One of the things that Mayor Tavares did in Providence right away was, I'm sorry, but there was a tax raise, or he's talking about a tax raise. He went to the businesses, nonprofit that they are, okay, and asked them. I know we don't have that many nonprofits in the town. We do have some large corporations. In the report, I don't see anything. You're asking all of us to help and to make concessions. Understand that. What is the town doing? What concessions are they making? I don't hear anything.
Well, I'm gonna
Thank you.
I'm gonna disagree with you in terms of what the town hasn't done anything. I think if you look at what the town's done to address both its OPEB and its pension, the town's been very proactive. Now, if after you look at the analysis that we'll provide to you, you want to make other suggestions as to how the town addresses it, we're telling you that we're going to be prepared to look at it.
Yes, sir. I had a question. Really, all in here, what you're asking for this, because everything here is retired,
Yes, sir.
is you're just really doing away with our COLAs.
Yeah, your current pension benefit
Staying
stays.
the same. So
Stays.
the COLA I get now is staying the same. And where we don't get the savings is Providence. We only get the 5, I don't know how the police works.
Yeah.
We get half of what the fire negotiates.
Right.
So like the last 2 years, I've got no raise, no COLA anyway.
Anyway, right.
So actually, that's why, what he was asking, that's why you can't, there was $1,500 stipend, because there is no savings there.
That's correct.
Because we're not getting them.
Right, because it's structured differently.
Right.
That's correct.
So really, the only retirees you're asking for is to do away with our COLAs,
Yes, sir.
right? Well, okay, even if we said, okay, we'll give you our COLAs for 20 years. In here, if I was still on the job, I'd be saying, I got 18 years in, I'm 40, I retired when I was 49, but, now I'd be saying, I gotta stay till I'm 55, I'm not adding my overtime pay, right, in your pension. You might get a majority of you guys in here to say, okay, here, my COLA right now, I'm getting nothing for the last 2 years, and when I get it, with the way the economy is, if you get 1%, I get half of that, which is diddly shit anyway. So you might get me to say, I'll give you that, and I'm maintaining my pension is, I guarantee that, right? But you're never gonna get an active guy to say, they're retiring now, some of the firemen, for, say, $60,000, $70,000 pensions, and you're gonna knock them down to 40 or 50. You said you met with the active guys?
We've begun our discussions, yes, sir.
There's no way they're gonna agree to this. What I understand is, if they have to agree, and we all have to agree, or it don't work.
Right.
Well, you might as well just say, we'll see you in court, because that's where it's going. There's no way a guy, everybody in here, you were all in the union, you were all on here, is anybody gonna agree to this, an active guy with 10 years on, he came on when he was 25, and now you're gonna tell him he's gonna go 55, he's not putting, his bust out pay, he's not putting his overtime pay in, he's, an average of 10 years, not like when I left, it was in my top 2 years. There's no way the active guys are agreeing to that.
Okay. Yep.
Bill, I had one more question about the process. So, I don't know the name of your actuary, the town's actuary, but, so, say for instance, our group decides to hire an actuary. What you're telling me is that we can sit down with your actuary, our actuary, and actually have a discussion about our ideas. It's gonna be a free discussion. In other words, there's not gonna be any,
Yeah.
What we've arranged, so you know, is say you hire
whomever.
Milliman, just use
Yep.
the name. And so Milliman would contact Siegel and say, okay, we want the data dump on our retirees, these 50 people, or the retiree group. They will give you the data dump. That will give you the ability to run scenarios like we did.
Right, but I'm beyond that point now. I have all the data, we have our actuary.
Yeah.
We want to sit down with somebody to have a frank discussion about why we think the plan should be changed, or here's our ideas. Are we going to have that dialogue?
Yes,
And I'm going to arrange that through you, or who am I going to arrange that through?
through us, right here.
Okay, all right. Thank you. Yes, Joe?
The actuary is Siegel for the pension on the OPEB pieces tonight.
Okay.
And right now, he's worried about that.
Yeah, we put it up to bid, so we have.
All right.
Hey, Counselor?
Yes.
Counselor, would you please use the microphone? I mean, we've been retired for quite a few years now.
Sorry.
Can you see me? I don't know if you can see me, with the map either. Yes.
Bill, I just have a couple of questions. If we come to an agreement, is this gonna be a consent judgment in Superior Court, similar to how Providence is doing?
I think it will depend on, it'll probably depend on the process, but I think that is a very likely,
All right, good.
scenario.
And
Well, I'm sorry, sir.
one more thing, Alan brought up a good point. We're in this predicament tonight, everybody's here, because previous administrations just failed to put funds into our pension. What guarantee do we have now going forward that this administration is gonna fulfill those obligations?
Well, part of it is, as you just said, is this gonna be a consent judgment? And
Well, that's what I asked.
Right, right, and that's one of the ways in which you have an enforcement mechanism in place.
And one important thing, you're aware of the fact that there's presently a case in the Supreme Court regarding our Ing funds.
Yes,
What's gonna happen if the Supreme Court rules oppose Judge Silverstein's ruling?
this will still work.
Still working? Wow. I don't know.
That's 17 million.
It'll still work.
And last but not least, the Medicare, from everything everyone I talked to was on it, says it's working great. The only problem I have is in the ordinance that was passed. I know this administration has been paying for Part B, prescription plan, and Plan 65. Right. Goes in the mayor, hits the lottery tomorrow, and a new mayor comes in and says, there's nothing in the ordinance that says we have to do that. What?
We've actually,
All the ordinance says is that you have to enroll in Medicare.
yeah, we've actually enacted, in addition to that ordinance, the town has also actually enacted a town of Johnston health insurance plan through the town council, and it's in that.
That's in that?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Bill, that gentleman raises a good point. Hopefully, we're not gonna get to the consent judgment phase, but let's assume we negotiate this before we have to go to court, or if we have to go to court. The agreement itself that we may reach, settlement agreement, it's not gonna be reviewed every 3 or 5 years. It's gonna be an agreement that we're gonna keep in place for long-term, or is it something you're anticipating we have to review this agreement?
Well, there's gonna be an oversight by the state, actually, once you submit the plan to the state, there are additional enforcement mechanisms through that process as well.
But putting the state aside for a moment, what's the town of Johnston's position on, let's say we strike a deal in a month. Is that deal good for the next 40 years, or are you gonna treat it like the CBI? Every 5 years or 3 years you review it? I just wanna get a handle on that.
No, the state's not gonna allow you to do it that way. The state wants a plan in which you get to 60% funded in 20 years. It's not gonna allow you to do a plan that, since he says, we'll check in with you every couple of years and we'll let you know how we're doing.
Okay, so if we come up with a plan that gets the town to the funding level it needs to be to in 20 years, then we're not gonna be addressing, or the retirees don't have to worry about addressing that again at a later date.
That's absolutely positively our approach.
And you raised a point about